on my travels, I meet a lot of people who deeply agree with most of the principles that you discussed today, and they understand this loss of sovereignty, and yet this is trumped by their short-term personal economic concerns of the risks. What advice would you give them?
Well, take a longer view. Now, it's perfectly understandable that people with certain commitments and certain feelings, either in their job or elsewhere, might take the view, my job is more at risk than others, and it will affect their voting behavior. And that's perfectly reasonable. And giving objective facts to people on this is not unreasonable. But, you know, we do know certain things. We do know that trade agreements are entered into for mutual advantage. Nobody does it on any other basis, and that's what it's always been and always should be. And so when people predict that you will not make trade agreements, they know that they are not telling the truth. The question for us as a campaign is we're not the government. We aren't into those negotiations. We don't know what is going to be the response of the European single market, the EEA, which contains some countries that are not even in it. And we ought to have had all those objective information put before us, as I said, first the Cabinet, then to Parliament, and then at an election, if you have a manifesto commitment to have a referendum, have the referendum, but have it fairly. You know, that's the issue. Why do you have referendum? It's because parties are split. If in a referendum, the Cabinet Secretary has a very heavy responsibility to try and make sure that it doesn't just become another way of getting the Prime Minister's way. A Cabinet Secretary, I sometimes wonder whether he knows the meaning of the word cabinet and thinks it's a sort of piece of furniture which should be moved from time to time to whichever Prime Minister he happens to be serving as a sort of presidential seat. Now, we've got to get back to some standards of objectivity and truth. We didn't in the 1975 referendum handle the relationship between the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office and the campaign very well, and we have since then learnt on referendums. That's why we have designated groupings. It seems to me absolutely extraordinary. The Prime Minister should deciding who he should stand up against. The designated group should choose who takes it part in these various encounters, whether it's ITV or BBC or Sky, and then the Prime Minister should be part of it if he wants to be. We're in the Purdah period. We need objectivity. Otherwise, referendum will fall into total disrepute. Maybe people want that to happen. But it is a device when parties are conflicted, and it needs objectiveness and truth, and people will vote, as you say, sometimes on their pockets. After all, they do in general elections. Jim Callaghan coined the phrase, the jingle in the pocket. This is not something to disparage. But I think they ought to look at unemployment levels in Europe. They ought to look at some of the consequences of what's happening out there in the organization which they are being asked to remain in.